The security guard's hand pressed against his chest, firm, unyielding. "Sir, you can't enter without proper identification." The words cut through the morning air like a blade. Harold Martinez stood there, 73 years old, wearing his cleanest shirt and his only pair of dress shoes. The shoes that had walked him through countless job interviews over the decades. The shoes that had carried him to his daughter's wedding. The shoes that now felt heavy as concrete on the marble steps of the federal building. "I just need to renew my benefits," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had learned long ago that speaking softly often got you further than shouting. But the guard wasn't listening. Not really. His eyes had already moved past Harold, scanning for the next person in line, dismissing him like yesterday's newspaper. "Next," the guard called out, and Harold felt something crack inside his chest. Not his ribs, though those had been broken before in a place far from home, in a war most people preferred to forget. This was something deeper, something that had been building for years, every time someone looked through him instead of at him. Every time his gray hair and weathered hands marked him as invisible, irrelevant, a relic from a time that no longer mattered. The line moved forward. Bodies pressed against Harold from behind, impatient, checking their phones, living their lives. A young woman in a crisp business suit stepped around him, flashing her government ID like a golden ticket. The same guard who had stonewalled Harold smiled at her, held the door open, wished her a pleasant day. Harold watched her heels click against the marble, each step echoing in the vast lobby like tiny hammers against his dignity. He reached into his wallet again, fingers trembling slightly, not from age but from something else, frustration maybe, or humiliation. The worn leather wallet contained his driver's license, expired by exactly 3 days. 3 days. In a life that had spanned 7 decades, 3 days seemed like nothing, but to the guard those 3 days might as well have been 3 centuries. "Sir, I told you already, no valid ID, no entry. That's the policy." The guard's voice had grown sharper, more aggressive. Other people in line were starting to stare. Harold could feel their eyes on him, could hear the quiet whispers, the subtle sighs of annoyance. He was becoming that old man, the one who held up lines, the one who couldn't keep his paperwork in order, the one who belonged in the past, not in the present, certainly not in their way. Harold's hands found the small pin on his jacket lapel. He had worn it every day for the past 5 years, since his retirement. It was small, unassuming, the kind of thing most people would glance at and forget. But his fingers knew every ridge, every curve of the tiny piece of metal. It had been pinned to his uniform for 26 years, through 3 tours of duty, through heat that could kill a man and cold that could freeze his soul, through nights when the only thing between him and eternity was the training hammered into him by sergeants who cared more about keeping him alive than keeping him comfortable. "Please," Harold said, and the word tasted like ashes in his mouth. He had never been a man to beg. Even as a child growing up in a household where pride was sometimes the only thing they had for dinner, he had learned that dignity was not negotiable. But here he was, in a building funded by his tax dollars, built by his generation's sacrifices, begging a kid young enough to be his grandson for permission to access services he had earned with blood and time. The guard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, thumbs moving quickly across the screen, completely absorbed in whatever digital drama was unfolding in his palm. Harold might as well have been a statue, a decoration, a piece of furniture that someone had forgotten to move out of the way. Behind Harold, the line grew longer. More suits, more briefcases, more people with places to be and important things to do. People who belonged in this building, in this time, in this world that seemed to have less and less room for men like Harold Martinez. Men who remembered when a handshake meant something, when your word was your bond, when the color of your uniform mattered more than the color of your skin or the size of your bank account. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the lobby floor. Harold stood in one of those shadows, feeling smaller and more insignificant with each passing minute. He thought about leaving, about walking back to his car, driving home to his empty apartment, calling the benefits office, trying to sort this. Out over the phone. It would be easier, less humiliating, less public. But something kept his feet planted on that marble floor. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the memory of all the other times he had been told he didn't belong somewhere, all the other doors that had been closed in his face, all the other lines he had been asked to step out of. Some fights, he had learned, were worth having, even when you knew you might lose. Especially when you knew you might lose. The guard looked up from his phone finally, irritation flashing across his face like Harold was somehow responsible for interrupting his digital entertainment. "Look, sir, I don't know how many times I need to explain this to you. Rules are rules. No exceptions. You want to come back when you have proper identification, that's fine. But right now, you need to step aside and let these other people through. Step aside." The words hung in the air, like smoke from a fire that had been burning for too long. Harold had stepped aside many times in his life. He had stepped aside when they told him his kind wasn't welcome in certain restaurants. He had stepped aside when they said he was too young, too inexperienced, too different. But he had also learned that sometimes stepping aside meant stepping away from who you were meant to be. Sometimes holding your ground was the only way to keep your soul. That wasn't just any old man. That was Harold Martinez, recipient of the Bronze Star for Valor in Combat, veteran of 3 tours in Vietnam, survivor of the Tet Offensive, and holder of a Purple Heart that he kept in a drawer at home because he had never felt the need to wear his pain like jewelry. But the guard didn't know any of that. To him, Harold was just another inconvenience, another obstacle between him and his coffee break, another old man who couldn't figure out how the world worked anymore. The morning was about to become something entirely different, something that would be talked about for years to come, something that would remind everyone present that some uniforms, once worn with honor, never truly come off. They just become invisible to people who have never worn one themselves, people who have never stood in the gap between freedom and chaos, between home and horror, between the America that is and the America that was fought for with blood and sacrifice and dreams of something better. But Harold didn't know what was coming. Not yet. All he knew was that his feet hurt, his pride was bruised, and somewhere in the distance, a car door was closing with the kind of authority that changes everything. What happened next would rewrite the rules of respect and remind everyone, watching, that some battles are won not with weapons, but with recognition. Not with force, but with honor. Not with shouting, but with a simple gesture that carries the weight of decades and the power to stop time itself. The morning sun continued to stream through those windows, but soon it would illuminate something far more important than marble floors and government protocols. It would light up the face of a man who had served his country with distinction and was about to be reminded, in front of everyone, exactly what that service meant, what it had always meant, what it would always mean. The guard's attention was already drifting again, back to his phone, back to his small world of digital distractions and policy manuals. He had no idea that history was about to walk through those doors. That leadership was about to demonstrate what real authority looks like. That in just a few moments, everyone in that lobby would learn the difference between following rules and understanding why those rules exist in the first place. The sound of footsteps echoed from outside, measured and purposeful, moving with the kind of precision that comes from decades of discipline and command. Harold heard them but didn't turn around. He was too tired, too defeated, too focused on the impossible choice between surrendering his dignity and standing his ground until security was called and his humiliation became complete. But those footsteps were getting closer. And with them came something that hadn't been in that lobby for a very long time. Something that was about to change everything for Harold Martinez and everyone who had the privilege of witnessing what true leadership looks like when it recognizes true service. The sound of those footsteps would echo in Harold's memory for the rest of his life. They would echo in the memories of everyone present. They would echo through the stories told at dinner tables and in coffee shops and in the quiet moments when people remembered that dignity isn't something you earn or lose based on the bureaucracy of the moment. It's something you carry with you, something that becomes part of who you are. something that others recognize when they have learned to see with eyes that understand what sacrifice really means. Harold Martinez was about to discover that he had not been forgotten, that his service had not been ignored, that somewhere in this world, there were still people who understood the difference between a man with an expired ID and a man who had earned the right to walk through any door in any building that his sacrifices had helped to secure. The footsteps stopped just outside the entrance. Harold's story was about to become something extraordinary, something that would remind everyone present that respect isn't about age or appearance or bureaucratic compliance. It's about recognizing who people are beneath the surface, understanding what they've done when no one was watching, and honoring the price they paid for freedoms that too many people take for granted. But what nobody expected was about to unfold right there in that lobby, in front of witnesses who would carry this story with them for the rest of their lives. A story about an old man who just wanted to renew his benefits and discovered instead that some battles, once won, create ripples that last forever. Some uniforms, once worn with honor, command respect across generations. Some sacrifices, once made, are never truly forgotten by the people who understand what they mean. The morning was about to become legendary. Harold Martinez was about to discover that while bureaucracy might be blind to service, true leadership never is. The guard was about to learn a lesson about respect that no policy manual could ever teach, and everyone present was about to witness something that would restore their faith in the idea that honor, once earned, never expires, even when your ID does. Harold had served in Vietnam from 1968 to 1971, 3 tours that had taken him from a 19-year-old kid from East Los Angeles to a battle-hardened sergeant who understood that survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about keeping the men around you alive too. His unit had been part of the 1st Cavalry Division, and they had seen action in some of the most brutal engagements of the war. The kind of action that newspapers couldn't fully describe because words had limits, and some experiences existed beyond the boundaries of language. During the Tet Offensive in 1968, Harold's squad had been pinned down by enemy fire for 14 hours in a bombed-out school building in Hue City. 14 hours of hell that felt like 14 years, with ammunition running low and casualties mounting. Harold had crawled through broken glass and debris, dragging wounded soldiers to safety, making trip after trip while bullets chewed up the walls around him. He saved 6 men that day. 6 fathers, sons, brothers who went home to families they might never have seen again if not for Harold's courage under fire. The Bronze Star had been pinned to his chest 6 months later in a ceremony that felt surreal after the chaos of combat. Standing in formation, listening to citations being read, watching medals being presented to men who had done extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances. Harold remembered thinking that the medal felt heavier than it should have, not because of the medal, but because of what it represented, the weight of other men's lives. The weight of decisions made in split seconds when there was no time to think, only time to act. But the hardest part of Vietnam wasn't the combat. It was coming home to a country that wasn't sure it wanted to thank him for his service. Airport. Protesters who called him a baby killer. Job interviewers who looked at his military record and worried about hiring damaged goods. Neighbors who changed the subject when he mentioned where he had been for the past 3 years. The silence was worse than the gunfire in some ways. At least in Vietnam, you knew where you stood. You knew who the enemy was. Back home, the lines were blurred, and sometimes it felt like everyone was the enemy, including yourself. Harold had married Maria in 1974, 3 years after his discharge. She was a nurse who worked at the VA hospital, and she understood the invisible wounds that didn't show up on X-rays or blood tests. She understood why he sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, sweating and shaking. Why he couldn't sleep without checking the locks on all the doors and windows. Why crowded places made him nervous and sudden loud noises made him drop to the ground before his conscious mind even registered the sound. They had built a good life together. Quiet, stable, anchored by love and mutual respect. Harold had worked for the post office for 32 years, a job that gave him structure and purpose without requiring him to explain his past to people who wouldn't understand anyway. Maria had continued nursing until her retirement, specializing in trauma care, drawn perhaps by her understanding of what trauma could do to a person and how healing required patience, skill, and an abundance of compassion. They had raised 2 children, Carmen and Miguel, both of whom had grown up understanding that their father was different from other fathers in ways that were hard to explain but important to respect. He didn't talk much about the war, but he talked about honor, about duty, about the importance of standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. He taught them that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was doing the right thing, even when you were afraid. Especially when you were afraid. Maria had died 3 years ago. Cancer that moved through her body like a ruthless enemy, taking territory she couldn't defend. Harold had sat by her hospital bed for weeks, holding her hand, reading to her, telling her stories about their life together. In the end, she had slipped away quietly, peacefully, surrounded by family and love. The funeral had been beautiful, full of people whose lives she had touched through her work and her kindness. But for Harold, it had also been the beginning of a loneliness that cut deeper than any wound he had ever received in combat. Since Maria's death, Harold had struggled with the basic mechanics of civilian life in ways that surprised him. Paying bills online, navigating automated phone systems, dealing with bureaucracies that seemed designed to frustrate rather than help. The world had become more complex, more digital, more impatient with people who couldn't keep up with the pace of technological change. Simple tasks that Maria had always handled now felt like military operations requiring intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and tactical execution. His benefits had become particularly complicated. Social Security, Medicare, VA disability, compensation, survivor benefits from Maria's nursing pension. Each agency had different requirements, different deadlines, different forms that needed to be filed in triplicate and submitted through specific channels. Harold had always been meticulous about paperwork during his military service, but civilian bureaucracy was different. It seemed designed by people who had never had to make life or death decisions under pressure, people who could afford to be inefficient because the stakes were never higher than inconvenience. The expired driver's license was a perfect example. Harold had received the renewal notice in the mail, but it had arrived the same week as Maria's birthday, the first one since her death. He had spent that week in a fog of grief, unable to focus on mundane tasks when every room in their apartment reminded him of her absence. By the time he had emerged from that emotional haze, the deadline had passed, and now he was facing the kind of bureaucratic catch-22 that would have been comical if it weren't so infuriating. To renew his license, he needed to visit the DMV with proper documentation. To access his benefits, he needed valid identification. To get to either location, he needed to drive, which technically required a valid license. The circular logic was maddening, the kind of administrative maze that seemed designed to exhaust people into giving up. Harold understood why some veterans simply stopped trying, why they allowed benefits they had earned to lapse rather than navigate systems that treated them like problems to be solved rather than people to be served. But Harold wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was something Maria had said during their last conversation. She had been weak, her voice barely above a whisper, but her message had been clear. Don't let them make you invisible, Harold. You matter. Your service matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Those words had carried him through the funeral, through the long nights in their empty apartment, through the daily struggle of building a life that made sense without the person who had given it meaning for nearly 50 years. Don't let them make you invisible. The phrase had become his mantra, his marching orders, his reason for getting up each morning and facing a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to people like him. Standing in that government building lobby, facing down a security guard who saw only an inconvenience, Harold could hear Maria's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside him. Don't let them make you invisible. He straightened his shoulders, feeling decades of military training activate muscle memory that hadn't faded with age. His spine aligned, his chin lifted, his eyes focused with the kind of intensity that had once been necessary for survival and was now necessary for dignity. If you believe that service to your country deserves recognition, that sacrifice earns respect, that the uniform may come off but the honor remains forever, then show your support for our veterans by hitting that subscribe button. Because stories like Harold's remind us that heroism isn't just about what happens on the battlefield, it's about how we treat our heroes when they come home. And what happened next would prove that some people in positions of authority still understand what that means. The guard was still focused on his phone, thumb scrolling through social media feeds, completely oblivious to the fact that he was about to receive an education in respect that no training manual could provide. Harold remained at his post, no longer asking for permission, no longer begging for consideration. He was simply waiting, with the kind of patience that comes from understanding that some battles are won not through force but through persistence, not through anger but through dignity, not through surrender but through the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you have nothing to prove to anyone because you have already proven everything when it mattered most. The footsteps outside had stopped, but Harold could sense movement, could feel the shift in energy that comes when someone of significance arrives on scene. He had learned to read these signs during his military service, when understanding the rhythm of a situation could mean the difference between success and disaster, between coming home and becoming a statistic. Something was about to happen. Something that would either vindicate his decision to stand his ground or prove that the world had indeed moved past the need to honor the sacrifices of his generation. Harold Martinez was about to discover which version of America still existed in the hearts of the people who mattered most. The America he had fought for, or the America that had forgotten why that fight had been necessary in the first place. The sound of multiple footsteps echoed through the lobby now, measured and purposeful, moving with military precision that made Harold's trained ear perk up despite his exhaustion and frustration. These weren't the casual steps of government employees heading to their morning meetings. These were the steps of people who had learned to walk with purpose, who understood that how you carried yourself communicated as much as what you said. Harold had heard footsteps like these before, in base camps and command posts, in places where leadership wasn't just a title on a business card, but a responsibility carried in your bones. The lobby had grown crowded as the morning rush intensified. Men and women in business suits moved through the security checkpoint with practiced efficiency, their government IDs and visitor badges serving as golden tickets to a world that Harold was being denied access to. They moved around him like water flowing around a stone, some glancing curiously at the old man who seemed to be having some kind of problem with security, others too absorbed in their phones and their schedules to notice him at all. Harold watched, their faces, looking for something he wasn't sure he would find. Recognition maybe, respect, some acknowledgement that he belonged here too, that his need to access government services was as legitimate as theirs. But what he saw instead was the casual indifference of people who had never had to fight for anything more significant than a parking space or a table at a popular restaurant. People who had inherited their freedom rather than earned it, who took for granted the very institutions that Harold's generation had bled to protect. It wasn't anger he felt toward them. It was something closer to sadness. These were the people he had served, the families he had helped to protect, the future he had believed in when he was 19 years old and terrified and thousands of miles from home. They were living the life he had fought to preserve for them. The fact that they didn't recognize the connection between their comfortable morning routines and his uncomfortable morning in a rice paddy 50 years ago didn't diminish the value of what he had done. It just made it more invisible, more abstract, easier to ignore when it became inconvenient. The security guard finally looked up from his phone, perhaps sensing the change in energy that the new arrivals had brought to the space. His expression shifted from bored irritation to something more alert, more professional. Harold could see him straightening up, putting the phone away, suddenly remembering that he was supposed to be doing a job rather than entertaining himself. "At government expense, can I help you?" the guard called out toward the entrance, his voice carrying a deference that had been completely absent from his interactions with Harold. The transformation was remarkable and immediate. The same person who had been treating Harold like a nuisance was now projecting the kind of customer service attitude that suggested actual training and professional standards. Harold turned to see who had commanded this sudden shift in attention and behavior. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. made his heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with his age and everything to do with recognition. Coming through the entrance was a group of 4 people, 3 in civilian clothes and 1 in a military uniform that Harold recognized immediately, even after all these years away from active duty. The uniform was crisp, immaculate, decorated, with ribbons and insignia that told the story of a career spent in service to something larger than oneself. But it wasn't the uniform that stopped Harold's heart. It wasn't the insignia or the bearing or the way the other 3 people deferred to the figure in military dress. It was something harder to define, something that could only be recognized by someone who had worn a uniform himself, who understood the weight that came with certain kinds of responsibility. The officer was a woman, probably in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She moved with the controlled grace of someone who had learned to command respect through competence rather than intimidation, who understood that real authority came from service rather than position. Harold had served under officers like this, people who led from the front rather than from behind desks, who understood that leadership was about taking care of the people under your command rather than advancing your own career. But what struck Harold most profoundly was the way she carried herself through the space. She wasn't just walking through a government building. She was inhabiting it, claiming it, making it clear through her presence that she belonged here in a way that transcended bureaucracy or protocol. This was someone who had earned her place through decades of service, who commanded respect not because of her rank, but because of what that rank represented. The security guard was practically standing at attention now, his earlier casual attitude replaced by something approaching reverence. "Good morning, General," he said, his voice carrying none of the dismissive tone he had used with Harold. "How can I assist you today, General?" The word hit Harold like a physical blow, not because it hurt, but because it explained everything. The bearing, the deference, the way the entire energy of the lobby had shifted with her arrival. This was someone who had climbed to the highest levels of military leadership, who had broken barriers and overcome obstacles that Harold could only imagine. Someone who understood, in ways that civilians never could, what it meant to serve your country when that service demanded everything you had to give and more. Harold found himself straightening even more, his military training asserting itself despite the decades that had passed since his discharge. In the presence of a general officer, certain behaviors became automatic, certain courtesies became essential. It didn't matter that he was no longer in uniform, no longer subject to military discipline. Some habits, once ingrained, became part of who you are, rather than just what you do. The general's eyes swept the lobby, taking in the scene with the kind of tactical awareness that comes from years of training and experience. Her gaze passed over the business suits and briefcases, over the security checkpoint and the government employees, and finally came to rest on Harold Martinez, standing in his clean shirt and dress shoes, holding his worn wallet, refusing to step aside, despite the bureaucratic obstacles that had been placed in his path. For a moment, their eyes met. Veteran to veteran, soldier to soldier, person to person. In that instant, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced since Maria's death, something he had almost forgotten was possible. He felt seen. Not just observed, but truly seen by someone who understood what it meant to put on a uniform and go where your country needed you to go, regardless of the personal cost. The general's expression changed almost imperceptibly, a subtle shift that might have been invisible to civilian eyes, but was crystal clear to anyone who had learned to read the nonverbal communication that becomes essential in military environments. It was the look of recognition, of understanding, of one professional acknowledging another across the barriers of time and circumstance and rank. Harold watched as the general said something quietly to one of her companions, then began moving in his direction with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested a decision had been made, a course of action had been determined. Whatever was about to happen, Harold sensed that it would be significant, not just for him, but for everyone present. Moments like this had a way of becoming stories, memories that people carried with them, lessons that got passed down through families and communities. The business suits and government employees had begun to notice the general's movement. The way she was cutting through the crowd with military precision and obvious intent. Conversations stopped, phones were lowered, attention focused on whatever was about to unfold in the lobby of a federal building on what had started as an ordinary Tuesday morning. Harold remained where he was, no longer trying to argue with the security guard, no longer focused on the expired identification in his wallet. Something larger was happening, something that transcended the petty bureaucracy that had brought him here in the first place. He could feel it in the air, in the way the general moved, in the sudden silence that had fallen over a space that had been buzzing with conversation and activity just moments before. The general stopped directly in front of Harold, close enough that he could see the details of her ribbons, close enough to read the name tape on her uniform, close enough to understand that whatever was about to happen was deliberate, intentional, planned with the kind of precision that comes from a lifetime of making decisions under pressure. What nobody expected was about to unfold right there in that lobby, in full view of security guards and government employees and business people who had never seen anything like what they were about to witness. A master class in leadership, in recognition, in the kind of respect that transcends rank and protocol and bureaucratic convenience. A demonstration of what it means when one professional recognizes another, when service acknowledges service, when honor salutes honor, regardless of the circumstances that brought them together. Harold Martinez was about to discover that his service had not been forgotten, that his sacrifices had not been ignored, that somewhere in the machinery of government there were still people who understood what those sacrifices meant and why they mattered. The security guard was about to learn a lesson about respect that would change how he saw every veteran who walked through those doors for the rest of his career. And everyone present was about to witness something that would restore their faith in the idea that America still remembered how to honor the people who had put their lives on the line to defend her. The general raised her hand, and Harold's heart stopped. Not from fear, but from recognition. From the sudden understanding of what was about to happen, what it meant, why it mattered. After all these years, after all the indignities and invisibility and casual dismissal, someone was about to remind everyone present that some sacrifices are too important to be forgotten, some service too valuable to be ignored. The morning was about to become historic. Harold Martinez was about to receive the recognition that should have been his every day for the past 50 years, but had somehow been lost in the bureaucracy of ordinary life. And everyone watching was about to learn what it looks like when America remembers how to honor her veterans. General Patricia Hawkins had not planned to visit the federal building that morning. Her schedule had called for a meeting at the Pentagon, followed by lunch with congressional staffers who were working on Veterans Affairs legislation. But her aide had received a call from a colleague who worked in the building, someone who had mentioned seeing an elderly veteran having trouble with security, someone who thought the general might want to know about the situation. Patricia Hawkins had not risen to the rank of brigadier general by ignoring situations that demanded her attention. She had built her career on the principle that leadership meant showing up, especially when showing up was inconvenient or unexpected or outside the normal parameters of your job description. She had learned that principle as a second lieutenant in Iraq, when she had discovered that the theoretical leadership training they gave you in the classroom meant nothing if you couldn't apply it in the real world, under pressure, when people were counting on you to make the right decision, even when you weren't sure what the right decision was. The call had come just as she was leaving her hotel for the Pentagon meeting. "General, there's an elderly Hispanic gentleman at the federal building on Constitution Avenue, seems to be a veteran, having some kind of problem with security. Thought you might want to know." The aide who called wasn't even sure why he was calling, just that something about the situation had bothered him, had seemed like the kind of thing that General Hawkins would want to be aware of. Patricia had redirected her driver without hesitation. The Pentagon meeting could wait. Congressional staffers could reschedule. But an elderly veteran being disrespected by government security? That demanded immediate attention, the kind of leadership moment that defined what you stood for when nobody was watching. She had learned about respect the hard way, through years of proving herself in environments where respect had to be earned rather than assumed. As one of the first women to serve in combat roles, she had faced skepticism, resistance, and outright hostility from people who believed that leadership was something that came with a specific gender rather than specific qualifications. She had responded not with anger but with excellence, not with demands but with demonstration, showing through her actions what competence looked like regardless of who was providing it. The ride to the federal building had taken 12 minutes. 12 minutes during which Patricia had thought about all the veterans she had served with, all the men and women who had put their lives on the line and then come home to a country that sometimes forgot to say thank you. She thought about her own father, a Korean War veteran who had spent 30 years working construction after his discharge, who had never complained about the lack of recognition, but had sometimes wondered, late at night, whether anyone remembered what his generation had done for their country. She thought about the soldiers she had commanded in Iraq and Afghanistan, young men and women who had followed her orders into situations where following orders could get you killed, who had trusted her judgment when their lives depended on making the right decision under impossible circumstances. Many of them were probably civilians now, trying to navigate VA bureaucracy, dealing with injuries both visible and invisible, struggling to translate military skills into civilian success. How many of them had faced the same kind of dismissive treatment that was apparently happening to the veteran in the federal building? Walking into that lobby, Patricia had immediately assessed the situation with the tactical awareness that had kept her alive and effective through multiple combat deployments. She saw the security guard, young and confident in his authority, but lacking the wisdom that comes from understanding what authority really means. She saw the business people, absorbed in their own concerns, oblivious to the drama playing out at the security checkpoint. And she saw Harold Martinez, standing with the kind of military bearing that decades of civilian life couldn't completely erase, refusing to surrender his dignity even in the face of bureaucratic humiliation. The bronze star pin on Harold's jacket had caught her attention immediately. It was small, easy to miss if you didn't know what to look for, but Patricia knew. She had recommended soldiers for bronze stars, had seen them awarded in ceremonies that honored extraordinary valor under fire. The bronze star wasn't something you received for showing up or following orders. It was something you earned by going above and beyond when going above and beyond meant putting other people's lives ahead of your own safety. Standing in front of Harold Martinez, Patricia could see the young soldier he had once been beneath the weathered features of the man he had become. She could see the pride that had never been broken, the dignity that had never been surrendered, the quiet strength that had carried him through decades of service and sacrifice and ordinary heroism that nobody had bothered to recognize because it didn't fit the convenient narrative of what heroism was supposed to look like. Patricia Hawkins raised her right hand to her forehead in a salute that was crisp, professional, and absolutely unmistakable in its meaning. A general officer saluting, a veteran, a leader recognizing service, a soldier honoring another soldier across the barriers of rank and time and circumstance. The gesture was simple, traditional, and revolutionary all at the same time. The lobby fell silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones were lowered. Every eye in the space focused on the extraordinary scene playing out in front of them. A general officer, in full dress uniform, saluting an elderly man in civilian clothes who had been denied entry to a government building because his identification had expired 3 days ago. Harold Martinez felt 50 years of civilian life fall away in an instant. His right hand moved to his forehead automatically, muscle memory taking over from conscious thought, returning the salute with the precision and pride that had been drilled into him during basic training and refined through 3 tours in Vietnam. For a moment, he wasn't a 73-year-old man with an expired driver's license. He was Sergeant Harold Martinez, United States Army, Bronze Star recipient, veteran of the Tet Offensive, soldier. The salute lasted exactly 3 seconds, the standard duration that had been prescribed in military manuals and practiced in countless ceremonies and honored in situations like this when recognition was more important than regulation. 3 seconds that contained decades of service, sacrifice, and mutual respect. 3 seconds that reminded everyone present what honor looked like when it was genuine rather than ceremonial. General Hawkins lowered her hand and spoke in a voice that carried the authority of command and the warmth of genuine respect. "Sergeant Martinez," she said, and Harold felt his heart skip at hearing his rank spoken aloud after so many years of being just another old man in a crowd of people who didn't see him. I'm General Patricia Hawkins, United States Army. It's an honor to meet you, and it's a disgrace that you've been treated with anything less than the respect you've earned. The security guard was standing at attention now, though he probably didn't realize it. His casual authority had evaporated the moment the general had entered his space, replaced by the kind of nervous respect that comes from suddenly understanding that you are completely out of your depth. He was looking back and forth between Harold and the general, trying to process what was happening, trying to understand how the old man with the expired ID had suddenly become the center of attention for a general officer. "General," Harold replied, his voice steady despite the emotion that was threatening to overwhelm him. "The honor is mine, ma'am. I was just trying to renew my benefits, but there seems to be some confusion about my identification." General Hawkins turned to look at the security guard, and her expression carried the kind of controlled intensity that had once motivated soldiers to follow her into combat zones. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, though her tone made it clear that she already understood exactly what the problem was and had very specific ideas about how it should be resolved. The guard stammered, suddenly aware that his casual dismissal of Harold had been witnessed by someone whose opinion mattered considerably more than his supervisor's. "Well, ma'am, his driver's license is expired, and our policy states that we can't allow entry without valid identification, and I was just following procedure and—" "Stop," General Hawkins said quietly, and the single word carried enough authority to silence not just the guard but everyone within hearing distance. "Do you see this man's bronze star pin?" The guard looked at Harold's jacket, squinting as if he were seeing the small piece of metal for the first time. Which, in a way, he was. 30 minutes ago, it had been just another detail on just another old man's jacket. Now it was something that commanded attention, respect, recognition. "Yes, ma'am," the guard replied, though his voice suggested he had no idea what the pin meant or why it mattered. "Do you know what a bronze star represents?" General Hawkins asked, and there was something almost educational in her tone, as if she genuinely wanted to make sure the guard understood what he was looking at. "No, ma'am," the guard admitted, and Harold could see the first hints of shame beginning to creep into his expression. "The Bronze Star is awarded for heroic or meritorious service in combat operations," General Hawkins explained, her voice carrying to every corner of the lobby, ensuring that everyone present would learn something they might not have known before. "It means that this man put his life on the line for his country. It means that he went above and beyond the call of duty when going above and beyond could have gotten him killed. It means that he earned the respect of his fellow soldiers and his commanding officers through acts of courage that most people will never have to perform." Harold felt tears building behind his eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of being seen, being understood, being recognized for something he had done 50 years ago that still mattered today. He had carried the weight of that service quietly for decades, never asking for special treatment, never demanding recognition, never using his military record as a way to get ahead in civilian life. But hearing it spoken aloud by someone who understood what it meant, having it explained to people who had never considered what that small pin on his jacket represented, felt like a gift he hadn't known he needed. "Furthermore," General Hawkins continued, "this man's service to his country has earned him the right to access the services and benefits that this building provides. The fact that his driver's license is expired by 3 days is a bureaucratic inconvenience, not a reason to deny him the respect and assistance he has earned through his sacrifice." The guard was nodding now, understanding beginning to dawn on his face, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. Harold could see him processing the information, connecting the dots between the old man he had dismissed and the soldier he had been, beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. "Sir," the guard said, turning to Harold with an expression that was completely different from the one he had worn 30 minutes earlier. "I apologize. I didn't understand. Please, let me help you with whatever you need." Harold nodded, accepting the apology with the grace that had carried him through decades of dealing with people who didn't understand what his generation had experienced. "Thank you," he said simply, because grace under pressure was something he had learned in rice paddies and fire-base perimeters, in situations where holding on to your humanity was the difference between being a soldier and being something else entirely. General Hawkins placed her hand on Harold's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that was witnessed by everyone in the lobby. "Sergeant Martinez, would you allow me to escort you to wherever you need to go in this building? I think we can expedite whatever bureaucratic processes you're dealing with." Harold felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked away for years, decades, since Maria's death, since retirement, since the slow realization that the world had moved on and left him behind. But here was proof that he had not been forgotten, that his service still mattered, that there were still people in positions of authority who understood the connection between the freedoms they protected and the people who had fought to preserve those freedoms. "That would be an honor, General," Harold replied, and he meant it. Not just because it would solve his immediate problem, but because it would give him a few more minutes in the presence of someone who understood what service meant, what sacrifice cost, what honor looked like when it was genuine rather than ceremonial. As they walked toward the elevators, Harold could feel the eyes of everyone in the lobby following them. He could hear the whispered conversations, the questions being asked, the explanations being shared. The story of what had just happened would spread through the building, through the families of the people who had witnessed it, through the communities where those families lived. It would become one of those stories that people told their children, that got shared at dinner tables and coffee shops, that reminded everyone who heard it that heroism came in many forms, and that respect was something that should be offered freely to people who had earned it. The elevator doors closed behind them, and Harold found himself alone with General Hawkins and two of her aides. In the confined space, he could see the details of her uniform more clearly, could read the story of her own service in the ribbons and insignia that decorated her chest. She was a soldier's soldier, someone who had risen through the ranks not because of politics or connections, but because of competence, courage, and the kind of leadership that inspired others to follow. "Sergeant," General Hawkins said as the elevator climbed toward whatever floor would resolve Harold's bureaucratic problems, "I want you to know that what just happened down there was not charity. It was not a favor. It was simply the right thing to do. You earned the right to be treated with respect 50 years ago, and that right doesn't expire with your driver's license." Harold nodded, unable to speak around the emotion that was threatening to overwhelm him. He had not expected this morning to become a reminder of who he had been, who he still was beneath the accumulated years and disappointments and small defeats that made up ordinary civilian life. He had certainly not expected to be saluted by a general officer in the lobby of a federal building while dozens of people watched and learned and remembered. "Thank you, General," he finally managed to say. "This means more than you know." "Oh, I think I have some idea," General Hawkins replied, with a smile that carried the warmth of shared understanding. "We take care of our own, Sergeant. That's not just a saying, it's a promise, and it's a promise that doesn't have an expiration date." The elevator stopped, the doors opened, and Harold Martinez stepped out into a hallway where his problems would be solved quickly and efficiently, where his service would be honored rather than ignored, where he would be treated with the dignity that should have been his from the beginning. Behind him, General Patricia Hawkins watched with satisfaction as bureaucracy bent to accommodate honor rather than the other way around. The morning had become exactly what it needed to become, a reminder that some battles are won not with weapons, but with recognition. Some victories are achieved not through force, but through the simple act of treating people with the respect they have earned. Some moments change everything, not because they are dramatic or spectacular, but because they are right. Harold Martinez had come to the federal building to renew his benefits. Instead, he had renewed his faith in the idea that service matters, that sacrifice is remembered, that honor never goes out of style. The security guard had learned a lesson about respect that would change how he saw every veteran who walked through those doors. The people in the lobby had witnessed something that would remind them for years to come, that heroism comes in many forms, and that the elderly man standing in line in front of you might have a story that would humble you if you took the time to learn it. And General Patricia Hawkins had done what leaders do. She had shown up when it mattered, had stood up for what was right, had used her authority to protect someone who couldn't protect himself. She had demonstrated that real power comes not from the ability to exclude, but from the wisdom to include, not from the capacity to diminish, but from the strength to elevate. The ripples from that morning would spread far beyond the federal building, far beyond the immediate problem that had brought Harold there in the first place. The security guard would tell his family about the veteran with the Bronze Star and the general who had saluted him. The business people would share the story with their colleagues and friends. The government employees would remember what they had witnessed and perhaps see their own work differently, understanding that the services they provided weren't just bureaucratic functions, but connections to real people, with real stories and real sacrifices that had made their comfortable lives possible. Harold Martinez had entered that building as just another old man with an expired driver's license. He had left it as Sergeant Harold Martinez, Bronze Star recipient, veteran of 3 tours in Vietnam, American hero whose service had been publicly acknowledged by someone whose opinion mattered, whose sacrifice had been honored by someone who understood what sacrifice meant. But more than that, he had left that building with something he hadn't possessed when he walked in. He had left with the knowledge that he had not been forgotten, that his service still mattered, that there were still people in positions of authority who understood the debt that could never be fully repaid to the men and women who had put their lives on the line when their country needed them most. The morning had started with injustice and indifference. It had ended with honor and recognition. Harold Martinez had come looking for bureaucratic assistance and had found something far more valuable, proof that respect, once earned, never truly expires. That service, once given, creates bonds that transcend time and circumstance and the petty inconveniences of ordinary life. As Harold walked to his car, his benefits renewed and his dignity restored, he could feel Maria's presence beside him, could hear her voice saying the words that had carried him through the darkest moments since her death. "Don't let them make you invisible, Harold. You matter. Your service matters." Today, he had not been invisible. Today, his service had mattered. Today, in a lobby full of strangers, he had been seen and honored and recognized for who he was and what he had done and why it still mattered 50 years later. Today, Harold Martinez had been reminded that once a soldier, always a soldier, and that some uniforms, once worn with honor, command respect for a lifetime. The drive home was different from the drive there. Harold sat straighter behind the wheel, shoulders back, chin up, carrying himself with the pride that had been restored by a general's salute and the recognition that had been too long delayed. He thought about calling his children, sharing the story of what had happened, helping them understand why it mattered not just to him, but to everyone who valued the freedoms that their grandfather had helped to secure. He thought about Maria, about how proud she would have been to see him honored publicly, to watch a general officer salute the man she had loved for 50 years. She had always known who he was beneath the quiet exterior, had always understood the weight he carried, the sacrifices he had made, the courage he had shown when courage was the only option available. Today, others had seen it too. Harold Martinez drove home as Sergeant Harold Martinez, Bronze Star recipient, American veteran, honored soldier. The morning had begun with bureaucratic humiliation and had transformed into something approaching redemption. Not because he needed to be redeemed, but because he needed to be remembered. Because his service needed to be acknowledged. Because his sacrifice needed to be honored by people who understood what honor meant. The security guard would never again look at an elderly veteran and see only an inconvenience. The people in that lobby would never again dismiss the quiet dignity of their elders without wondering what stories they carried, what sacrifices they had made, what honors they had earned. General Patricia Hawkins would continue to lead by example, showing others what it meant to use authority in service of justice rather than convenience. And Harold Martinez would remember, for the rest of his life, the morning when a general officer saluted him in a government lobby and reminded everyone present that some services